and we all live in this valley, and we have like flocks of, I don't know, sheep or something, right? We're shepherds. So we are finally ready to move on to HLA Hart's own theory of law. Previously, we were reading the chapters of Hart's book that attack Austin's theory. They attack another theory of law. But now we're at chapter 5, and in chapter 5 we get the first sort of half of the presentation of Hart's own view. The second half of it is going to come in chapter 6. And if we're going to understand Hart's theory, the first thing we need to understand is the distinction that he makes between what he calls primary and secondary rules. So here's the difference. Primary rules are regular rules that apply to the behavior of regular citizens. So, for example, there's some rule, right, of a game, right? There's a rule of a children's game, and the rule is that you can only kick the ball, right? You can't touch the ball with your hands. You can't, I don't know, do other things. You can only kick it. That's the only way that you're allowed to move the ball on the field. That's a rule that applies to the players, the kids that are playing. But then, if this game becomes more popular, and there are many more people playing it who don't know each other very well and can't cooperate with each other as well in the sort of natural, informal way that children can cooperate with other children that they know, then you might have to have all sorts of rules about the rules. There's a rule here that says that you can only kick the ball, but then there's going to be a rule that says the commissioner can change the rules. And then, of course, there's going to be rules about who becomes the commissioner and how they become the commissioner, right, of the league. That is, the league is going to have referees, and it's going to have commissioners, and it's going to have all this other stuff. These rules are rules about rules. They're rules about how to change these rules and all sorts of stuff like that. They're rules about who gets to make those rules, who gets to decide whether these rules have been violated, right? That's the referee or whatever, or the umpire. The secondary rules are the rules about rules. And then, of course, there's going to be rules about rules about rules. But all those rules all the way up, they all count as secondary, right? So there's just two categories for Hart. There's the first order rules about how to play the game, and then there's all of the additional second order, third order, fourth order, fifth order rules about rules, and they all count as secondary. That's the distinction between primary and secondary rules. Notice, very importantly, Hart, 2 chapters ago, I think in chapter 3, he made this distinction between duty-imposing rules and power-conferring rules. This was a distinction that Hart made as part of his criticism of Austin's view. The criticism was that legal systems have power-conferring rules, but that Austin's theory can't capture those rules, explain how they could exist, that sort of thing. Anyway, these are different distinctions. Typically, most of the primary rules will be duty-imposing. Most of the rules will say what people can or cannot do, and then the secondary rules will be a combination of both, although maybe primarily the power-conferring rules will appear as secondary rules. But these are different distinctions. This distinction has to do with whether the rule tells people what they may or may not do, what they must or must not do, versus whether the rules give people kinds of authority or normative power, right? And really maybe it's authority to change the duties of others. Anyway, that's a distinction that's different from whether the rules are about other rules or whether they're just ordinary rules directly about behavior. So here is the big claim that Hart is making in this chapter. The claim is this: in order for some system of rules to be a legal system, it must have both primary and secondary rules. A legal system can't be a legal system if it just has primary rules. You need both. This is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the existence of a legal system. If you didn't understand that, don't worry about it. The point is just that You need both types of rules, although there might be other things that you need in order to count as a legal system. That's the big claim, is that you need both. And the way that Hart illustrates this claim, the way that he illustrates, in particular, the usefulness of secondary rules, is first by imagining a system of rules where there are only primary rules. And then this system is going to run into all sorts of defects. It's going to run into all sorts of problems. And Hart is going to claim that in each case of a defect, there's a remedy for that defect that comes in the form of a secondary rule. And so these secondary rules, Hart thinks, naturally develop as a solution to these problems or as a remedy to these defects. Okay, before we get into the details of the defects, let's just understand a little bit better what a system of rules with only primary rules is like. We've already seen one example, and that's just sort of a simple child's game, right? Children make up a game, they play the game with one another, they don't have referees and umpires and commissioners and committees that decide how to change the rules, they don't have TV contracts, they don't have any of that stuff. They just have the ordinary rules that govern their interaction. Another example, an example that Hart mentions, is etiquette. Etiquette, rules about whether you take your hat off or which fork to use and that sort of thing, which clothes to wear to which kinds of events, how to greet someone, right? Rules of etiquette are always, it seems, systems merely of primary rules. There's no commissioner of etiquette that gets to change the rules on the spot or anything like that. Think about gendered rules of dress. At one point, women were not permitted by etiquette to wear pants in Western societies, some Western societies, right? That was a rule, but there was no rule about how to change this rule. And there was no rule saying that this is a rule, right? Specifying which rules count as rules of etiquette. There were just rules of dress, rules of attire, gendered social rules that people recognized. Enough people acknowledged these rules, accepted them in the right kind of way, and so these were the rules. And you couldn't change this rule quickly. It took a very long time to change the rule for whether women were allowed to wear pants out in the world. In order to change that rule, you had to change many, many minds. Whereas, if you have, for example, a secondary rule, a rule that allows a little council of people or even an individual to bang their gavel and change the rule, well then you can change the rule in an instant. Okay, I'm sort of getting ahead of myself. That's going to be one of the advantages of introducing secondary rules. Let's just jump right in to the 3 defects. The first defect is something that Hart calls uncertainty. This is what Hart says to explain this defect or this problem that systems of merely primary rules are going to face. Here's what Hart says. Hence, if doubts arise as to what the rules are, or as to the precise scope of some given rule, there will be no procedure for settling this doubt, either by reference to an authoritative text or to an official whose declarations on this point are authoritative. This is a problem that applies to a system of merely primary rules. So let's say, right, that we are a group of people and we live in a valley. There's our valley, okay? And in the valley, there's grass. I'll make the grass a different color, right? There's grass, right? On one side of the river and on the other side of the river. And we all live in this valley and we have like flocks of, I don't know, sheep or something, right? We're shepherds. That's the river. This is the river in the middle, okay? And there's grass on either side. We have a system of rules that are in place among us, and we all accept these rules. There's a few hundred of us living in this valley, that on certain weeks you shepherd your sheep on one side of the river, and on other weeks you shepherd your sheep on the other side of the river. Okay, fine. And this keeps keeps us from using up all the grass. It allows the grass to grow back before we release the sheep again, and this way we don't starve and die. We have some rules like this. This is a practice, and if someone violates one of these rules, we criticize them. Maybe we even punish them. But we don't have a town council. We don't have a king or a queen. We don't have any judges or rules about how to enforce these rules or anything like that. Rules about how to change these rules. So we don't have any secondary rules. We just have the regular rules about shepherding your sheep on the grass or whatever. And then there arises a dispute. Because say there's another valley, and at this other valley, there's the same situation. We now, someone starts marching over into this other valley, or there's a rock slide, and the rock slide reveals a passageway to this other valley. And at this other valley, there's the same deal. There's bits of grass on either side of a river. Okay? And there's a dispute as to whether or not the same rule applies to this new valley. That is, do you have to only graze your sheep on one side or the other on those certain weeks or whatever? What's the rule, right? Is the rule that you're only allowed to graze your sheep on one side or the other, or can you graze your sheep anywhere there because the rule doesn't apply over in this new place? If we just have primary rules, there's no way to settle this dispute. Some people say the rule is like this. It applies at every valley, right? And other people say, no, it doesn't apply in every valley. It just applied in the original valley. Well, what's the rule? There's no systematic way for resolving this dispute, right? Just like if there's a dispute as to what a rule of etiquette is, there's no systematic way of resolving that dispute. It's different if there are secondary rules, by the way, and this is going to be Hart's point. If there's a secondary rule that says, what counts as a rule, or who gets to decide what counts as a rule, then we have some way of figuring out what happens, what the deal is, what the rules are as they apply to this new second valley. This is a defect. This is a problem. We have no way of settling this dispute. And with no way of settling this dispute, well, people attack each other. They settle it with the sword or with their fists or whatever. That's the first defect. So there's uncertainty, and specifically, note, it's uncertainty about what the law is, or really what the rules are, right? Because there's no law at this point, because Hart thinks that when you just have primary rules and you have these kinds of defects, you don't even really have a legal system. Okay, but what the law is or what the rules are, right? It's uncertain what the law is. That's the first defect. Now, let's talk about the second defect. The second defect, Hart is going to call staticness. Hart doesn't actually say the word staticness. He just says that a system of merely primary rules is static. So we're going to use staticness, though, as our label for this second defect that applies to systems of rules that contain only primary rules. Here is what Hart says. The only mode of change in the rules known to such a society, that is, a society with merely primary rules, the only mode of change in the rules known to such a society will be the slow process of growth, whereby courses of conduct once thought optimal become first habitual or useful and then obligatory, and the converse process of decay, when deviations once severely dealt with are first tolerated and then pass unnoticed. He's talking about how rules change. If you merely have primary rules, then the rules can only change by getting everyone to agree on a new set of rules, right? And so the rules will therefore change very, very slowly. So here, let's go through this one sentence. The only mode of change in the rules known to such a society will be, and then we're going to get how rules change in systems with merely primary rules. The slow process of growth, whereby courses of conduct once thought optimal become first habitual or usual and then obligatory. For example, how did the rule that we have in our society, our little primitive society with a primitive system of rules of grazing your sheep only on one side of the river or whatever on certain weeks, how did that rule show up in the first place? Well, first, there was just a course of conduct that was thought optimal, right? It wasn't required, but it just seemed better. You know, if you switched the sides of the river that you were grazing your sheep on. First, that kind of behavior was thought to be the better kind of behavior. And then enough people in the community, a good majority of them, started to think that this was the best way to behave. It wasn't required, but it was the best way. And then after that, eventually, enough people think this way, it becomes habitual or usual. That is, it becomes common practice. Before, they just thought it was the best way to do it. Now, it's the way that basically everyone is doing it all the time. This takes place over the course of weeks or months or years or generations. And then eventually, the group of people, we in the valley, we start thinking of this pattern of behavior, this course of conduct, this pattern of grazing your sheep only on one side of the river on this week and on the other side at a different week. We start thinking of that course of conduct as obligatory. And that's what it is for it to be obligatory when you have a system merely of primary rules. Enough people think it's obligatory. Hart's view, by the way, of the existence of rules is going to turn out to be something like that. It's slow. You create new rules, but you create them very, very slowly if you just have a system of primary rules. And the same goes for getting rid of old rules, right? So think of our other example of a system of just primary rules, the gendered dress, right? This is gendered dress. A rule that says that women can't wear pants, right? How do you get rid of a rule like that? Well, if there's just primary rules, which there are in etiquette, right? Then there's a converse process of decay for getting rid of the rules. Deviations, once severely dealt with, are first tolerated and then pass unnoticed, right? So if a woman were to walk out into the public sphere at some time in certain places wearing pants, she would be severely dealt with. That is, she would be ostracized or maybe, actually sanctioned, maybe imprisoned or something like that, right? But certainly would be criticized openly. Then, more people start doing it. This takes years and years and years of work, or years and years and years of just slow change. And then eventually, that behavior is frowned upon by many, but tolerated. That is, people think to themselves when they see this behavior, that's not the right way to behave. She should be wearing a dress or a skirt or something like that. People think these things, but they don't say anything, or they say very little. They don't really do anything about it. They don't go and assault this woman or arrest her or anything like that. So it becomes that this behavior, which once was severely dealt with, is then tolerated, and eventually it passes unnoticed. Like that's where we are now. When a woman wears pants, no one even notices. It's not even a thing. Oh, she's wearing pants, as opposed to a dress or a skirt. Pants are a normal thing now. They are an acceptable form of attire given the gender rules of dress that we have in Western civilization today, or whatever. This all happens very slowly when you only have primary rules. But this is a kind of defect, if you think about it. In a certain sense, say that the grass got a disease, and much of the grass in the valley started dying. And we needed to act quickly. We quickly needed to make it the case that we changed the rules about when and how much you could graze your sheep on which portions of the grass in the valley, because if we didn't dial back the calories we were giving our sheep from the grass, then they would consume all of the living grass. And all the grass would die, and then the sheep would die, and we would die. So we need to quickly change the rules. But if we only have primary rules, you can't change the rule quickly because, well, it's just ordinary rules that exist because enough people accept them in the right kind of way. Even if we wanted to, we couldn't change the rules of gendered clothing, right, quickly. And even if they wanted to, these villagers, they couldn't quickly change the rule. There would be people who would still be using the old rule, right? It's very hard to get all these people on board. Whereas if you've got a system of secondary rules, by the way, where you've got a rule for how to change the rules, right? It says the town council has to pass a rule with X number of votes. then it might be hard to convince the town council, but it's at least possible to change the rule instantly. We get it. Staticness, the word static means unchanging. And this defect isn't really the fact that the rules don't change. It's really the fact that the laws or rules can only change very slowly. They can't change quickly, and they also can't change deliberately. A town council can change, or a king, or a Congress can change the rules in a very precise way, exactly as they intended. Whereas if you're trying to change the rules of gender dress or of where to graze your sheep, when you only have primary rules in the system of rules that govern your little valley society, right? The rules have to move slowly by a whole group of people, and maybe they don't change in exactly the right way that was intended by the person who set this change in motion. So that's the defect of staticness that you get when you only have a system of primary rules. Now we can move on to the third and final defect. And this third defect is called inefficiency. Here's what Hart says to explain this defect. Disputes as to whether an admitted rule has or has not been violated will always occur and will, in any but the smallest societies, continue interminably if there is no agency specifically empowered to ascertain, finally and authoritatively, the fact of violation. What does that mean? So, say that we agree about what the rules are, right? And say we don't need to change them. They're fixed for the moment, at least, and we know what the rules are. Let's say we agree, right, that the rule, back in the original valley here, says that you can't, graze your sheep on this side here on the first week of the month. Then someone claims to have seen someone else at night grazing their sheep on that side of the river. But the person accused says it wasn't them. They were somewhere else that night. They were at home and their sheep were all at home, or whatever. Well, what happened? What's the fact of the matter? Has the rule been broken or not? There's a dispute that arises. Someone accuses someone else and someone denies it. And then, this is going to continue interminably if we only have primary rules. Because we don't have a system in place, a system that can only exist when there are secondary rules that put in place police and judges and juries and the gathering of evidence and the holding of a trial or whatever. We don't have secondary rules that put all that stuff in place. We just have the first order primary rules that say where you can and can't graze your sheep. So there's no way to settle this dispute as to whether or not this person was really there breaking the rule, whether the rule was really broken, even if we can agree what the rule is in the first place. There's inefficiency in, determining if rules were violated. What we don't have is some way of settling these disputes as to whether someone broke the rules. So we've got our three defects, and we already know what the point of all this is. The point is that Hart thinks that there are specific kinds of secondary rules that are going to naturally arise among groups of people in order to solve these three problems or to remedy these three defects. Okay, so the remedy for each one is a type of secondary rule. Let's just quickly go through each. Uncertainty. We don't know what the law is. We don't know, for example, in this example, what the rule is as applies to this new valley that we've now entered, right? Well, there's got to be some secondary rule that we can come up with that says, what the rule is going to be. So either we've written down our rules and we have a rule that says whatever gets written down on this piece of paper by this official procedure counts as the rule, right? And so maybe the official procedure is, this is the rule about how you get to count as a rule is, you got to have 60% of the population show up and they've all got to agree and raise their hand in a certain way, and then someone writes it down and then they all read it and raise their hand again or whatever, right? There's some procedure in place that decides what the rule is, or maybe when there's a dispute like this, there's a judge that's empowered to decide what the law is, in this case, the case of the New Valley or something like that, right? And there's just a rule that says who gets to be the judge and what powers, a power conferring rule, that says what powers the judge has. That's the kind of secondary rule that would solve this problem or remedy this defect. And Hart's name for this kind of secondary rule is a rule of recognition. This is going to be, for Hart, the most important type of secondary rule. And it's going to be discussed also in Chapter 6, which we're going to talk about, next time or the time after next time or whatever. It's called the rule of recognition because it's a rule that recognizes what other rules count as rules in the system, what rules count as legally valid. Let's move on to staticness, right? Well, we have a problem where we can't change the rules quickly and we can't change them deliberatively. So we need another rule that says how to change rules. So maybe there's some rule that says, well, Congress can pass new laws or amend current laws if they've got this number of votes or whatever. So that's a power conferring rule giving Congress that power, right? And that's a secondary rule, right? There's some rule about how to change the rules, or maybe it's just a simple rule like the king can change them whenever the king wants. He just has to wear his crown and stand on one foot. That's how he changes rules. And then whatever he says, that's a new rule or something like that. And Hart calls secondary rules of this kind rules of change. They're just rules about how to change rules. Fine. And of course, the rules of change will also, in some cases, depending on how they're specified, allow the community, under certain procedures, to change even secondary rules. So you could even change, the rule of change would allow you, in many cases, to change the rule of change. Finally, inefficiency. That is, how do we determine what the facts of the case are, whether the person was really there on that night, it was really them, how many witnesses do we need, do we go to the video footage, all that sort of stuff. How do we tell if a rule has been broken? Hart calls the secondary rules that we put in place to solve this problem, he calls them rules of adjudication. These are going to be rules that say you get a jury together and you have a prosecutor and you have the defendant. The defendant is entitled to representation in the form of counsel, lawyers, or whatever. All the rules like that about how we get to decide, what kinds of evidence are needed, who the jury is the one that gets to decide the facts of the case, all that sort of stuff. Those are all rules of adjudication. And they're all secondary rules that remedy this defect. Those are all the main points that I wanted to make about the parts of Chapter 5 that we read for today. The main thing to pick up on is that Hart seems obviously right. Like, this group of people that only has primary rules and they live in the valley or whatever and they can't change their rules, they can't exactly settle disputes about what the rules even are, and they can't decide whether the rules in any given case have been violated or not, right? This group of people, they don't have a legal system yet because they don't have secondary rules. Once they get a whole bunch of secondary rules, they get rules that say who are going to be judges, and there's going to be juries, and there's going to be police, and there's going to be a Congress, or a king, or something like that. And there's going to be a constitution, maybe. Once they get all of that stuff, you add all that in, and now it becomes much more plausible that they have a legal system, something that really deserves the title law. There might be other conditions that they have to meet, but having secondary rules seems, as Hart thinks, seems to be, a necessary condition.